In the summer of 2020, during their annual developer conference, Apple announced a new version of macOS with some very interesting changes. There are a lot of features taken straight from iOS, including Control Center, widgets, and most notably, the icons. These new macOS icons mimic the shape and color palette of their iOS counterparts, but if you examine a little closer, there's something strange about the way that they look. They retain the abstract glyphs of iOS, but have depth and shading, which many journalists point out looks a lot like Skeuomorphism. And this subtle shift in design lets Apple bring continuity to their two most important platforms, but also lets them reference the rich visual history of macOS 10. It's a sign that UI design might be heading somewhere new and exciting very soon. This video is part 1 of 2 in a series I'm doing about Apple software design in both iOS and macOS. Today we'll be taking a look at Apple design from the early 2000s to the release of iOS 6 in 2012. In the next video, we'll be analyzing iOS 7 up until 2020's release of macOS Big Sur. To understand what Skeuomorphism is and where it came from, we need to go back to the late 90s when Apple was on the brink of collapse. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1996, the company had about 90 days left of cash in the bank. Jobs needed to cut the underperforming products in Apple's lineup and quickly develop new, successful products that would help bail Apple out. He wanted a sleek new user interface for the next version of macOS, and his plan was to take the cutting-edge technology he helped develop at Next, the computer company Jobs founded when he got kicked out from Apple, and turn it into the latest generation of macOS. And so, to redesign the user interface, he enlists the help of Scott Forstall, somebody who had been working for him since 1992. Scott Forstall was somebody who Jobs really liked from basically the moment that they first met. He had talent, ambition, and flair, much like Jobs himself. Earlier this year, Forstall revealed what Jobs said to him during the interview for his position at Next.
He stopped and he looked at me and he said, "I know you have to interview for the rest of the day. I don't care what anyone says. At the end of the day, I'm giving you an offer." And then he said, "But please, pretend you're interested in everyone's questions throughout the rest of the day." And then he looked at me and he said, "And I'm sure you're going to accept this offer."
Jobs and Forstall wind up becoming great friends. They agreed on philosophy and culture, and most importantly, on design. So when Jobs wanted a completely new design language for macOS, he goes to Forstall. Forstall developed this design system called Aqua, which Jobs really loved, and it started shipping with the release of macOS 10 in 2001. It looked like nothing else in its era. Buttons and other interface elements were glossy and looked like beads of water, and Jobs famously described them as,
"When you saw it, you wanted to lick it."
Application windows had drop shadows, which made them feel like they were floating on top of each other, giving the entire system a sense of depth and dimension.
See the shadows on the right of this window?
And icons looked like almost perfect representations of objects in the real world, complete with perspective, lighting, realistic material, and texture. The reason why Jobs wanted this design was probably influenced by his work at Pixar.
How many of you saw Toy Story 2?
It's a company that pioneered techniques to create and render fully computer-generated movies. As time went on, Apple added more effects to macOS 10 to increase the realistic ornamentation of the UI, including brushed metal in 10.3, reflective surfaces in 10.5, and fabric textures in 10.7. When Apple was developing the iPhone, Jobs again put Forstall in charge of designing the user interface, and so it ended up adopting a very similar design language to macOS 10. Interface elements had gloss, they had texture, metal, wood, leather, and so on. Forstall, now in charge of mobile software, was obsessed with designing user interfaces, and he would labor over it down to the smallest detail, which is probably why Jobs liked him so much. He reportedly kept a jeweler's loupe on his desk so he could inspect every pixel in an icon to make sure it was perfect. Now with iPhone and especially iPad, which came later, Forstall put a huge focus on designing the apps in such a way that they resembled and operated like the real world counterpart to that app. The Notes app, for example, was designed to look like a real notepad in this era of iOS. When you wrote in the notepad by typing, the typeface resembled handwriting. The Contacts app looked like a spiral-bound notebook, and Forstall was so committed to this visual metaphor that he even refused to make the book full height in portrait mode because then the book would look awkward. This style of design is called skeuomorphism. It's when a design references some past incarnation of the object or tool it's trying to be. If you were designing an app that's for jotting down ideas, that could be a yellow legal pad. For a contacts app, that could be a spiral notebook. And these illusions help you understand intuitively how to use the object. It draws on your previous knowledge of what exists in the physical world to explain what the app is for and how it works. And this is an especially useful analogy to make at the time, because if you're Apple, you're trying to convince the world that iPhone and iPad can replace all of these analog things in your life. So how do you persuade people that this one device can replace your calendar and your notepad and maybe even your contacts book, especially the people who may be uncomfortable making the switch? Well, you show them that your device has a calendar that looks just like their old calendar, a notepad that looks like their old notepad, and a contacts book just like the one they're familiar with. You are visually connecting the app with the object that that app can replace with a very simple metaphor. It's easy and it sells the product. By 2011, Apple's mobile devices ended up accounting for almost 70% of the entire company's revenue, which meant whatever Forstall was doing was working. Skeuomorphism doesn't just mean referencing objects that were around before computers though. One strange skeuomorph you probably encounter a lot even to this day is the save icon. Here it is in the current version of Microsoft Word. It still looks like a floppy disk. Now I'm sure a lot of you no longer save your documents to floppy disks or have never even used one to begin with, but back when personal computers were just starting to become popular, you saved documents on floppies. So designers needed an icon to represent the action of saving the changes to your documents, and they chose a floppy disk, which is a fairly reasonable decision at the time. But now that we've moved on to different storage methods, hard disks, solid state, and abstract concepts like saving to the cloud, the floppy disk icon has persisted, and it's become a skeuomorph because it represents the past incarnation of what we used to save documents to. It's just that we haven't come up with a better icon that represents this arguably abstract idea of saving a document. But this raises a very interesting concern about skeuomorphism. What happens when a design is referencing something that the user has never encountered before? Because for the generation that has never used the floppy disk and has no concept of what one is, the analogy is completely lost on them. The save icon is now outdated and it's become baggage. And then there's this other question. What should you do when you want to create something that doesn't exist in the real world? How do you design within a heavily skeuomorphic language something that doesn't have a real world analog? What should an internet browser look like? We have no concept of that in real life. What should an instant messaging app look like? We don't write messages to each other that isn't mail. At this point, I think you understand why so many designers felt skeuomorphism was problematic. If your idea didn't have a good visual analogy to a real-life object, you felt pressured to make one up. Sometimes Apple does this very well. In 2007, they released macOS 10.5, and the headline feature was Time Machine, a file backup tool that, when launched, let you travel back in time to view your old files against the backdrop of space. Now think about that for a second. Apple, in order to explain the concept of file backups to their customers, came up with this extraordinary visual metaphor of traveling back in time by flying through the cosmos, which is an incredibly creative idea when you think about it. It draws on our conceptual knowledge of time travel to create a very clever metaphor, and it turns file backup into a spectacle. But Apple at times also used skeuomorphs very poorly, finding very loose connections to real-life objects to imitate. Look at Apple's Game Center from iOS 6. Despite it resembling a card table with green felt wood paneling and chalked lines, you could not play a card game with this app. It was simply for managing your Game Center friends and viewing and tracking achievements. The point is that if I handed you this app, you probably would guess that it's for playing some sort of card game, but it's not. The metaphor has nothing to do with the function. It was unnecessary and confusing. And because of this excess ornamentation and obsession with referencing the past, there was this growing mountain of criticism from designers outside and even within Apple to move on from skeuomorphism. One of the most important critics was Johnny Ive, Apple's head of industrial design at the time, the person responsible for designing the computers and devices themselves. Ive hated skeuomorphism for reasons that we'll explore in the next video. Well, this is when Apple starts to lose its patience with Scott Forstall. Remember when I said Jobs and Forstall got along very well? Well, it turns out after moving to Apple, Forstall pretty much only ever got along with Jobs. Many of the executives and higher-ups at Apple really didn't like working with Forstall, and a few reportedly wouldn't even meet with him unless someone else was in the room mediating. But Forstall's abrasiveness was something that Jobs admired. Jobs liked friction between his teams because it led to internal competition, and that resulted in better products. When developing the first iPhone's software, Jobs wanted to know whether to shrink down the architecture of the Mac or to simply make a bigger iPod, so he pitted some Mac engineers led by Forstall against some iPod engineers to see who can make the better software. And in the end, Forstall won. A victory that let him dictate how mobile software at Apple looked for 6 generations. But when Jobs passed away, Forstall didn't have a friend left to vouch for him. Without anyone in his corner and growing pressure from other executives, Apple pushes Forstall out, and skeuomorphism leaves with him. Forstall left a legacy of incredibly rich and inventive user interfaces that redefined Apple during one of its most vulnerable times. Apps leapt from the screen and into our imaginations, and what Forstall and Jobs proved was that software didn't have to be boring. Even though history has not been kind to skeuomorphism, the designers at Apple still find ways to make reference to this storied past in their modern design, and even eventually welcome it in its new form.